Nina Carter was running late again as she pulled up to the Montgomery courthouse in her silver sedan. She glanced at the dashboard clock, 10 minutes until the trial began. Her chest tightened. Today wasn't just another court proceeding. Today could reshape how Alabama's judicial system handled racial profiling cases. Nina had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but the anticipation still made her heart pound. Stepping out of her car, she straightened her blazer and took a deep breath. As one of the first black judges in Montgomery, Nina had faced her share of resistance and adversity in the legal world. But today's case wasn't just about the law, it was personal. The defendant, a young black man named Elijah Brooks, had been arrested while jogging through his neighborhood. The arresting officer claimed Elijah fit the description of a burglary suspect. To Nina, it was an all-too-familiar story, and she was determined to oversee the trial with fairness and integrity. She crossed the parking lot briskly, her heels clicking against the pavement. Avoiding the media frenzy gathered at the main entrance, she headed for a side door. Reporters and their flashing cameras swarmed the courthouse steps, eager to capture the case that had already drawn national attention. As she approached the less conspicuous side door, a white police officer stationed there stepped forward. His stance was rigid, and his gaze followed her closely. Nina instinctively reached for the ID badge hanging around her neck, ready to display it as usual. But before she could present it, the officer stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said sharply, his tone clipped. Nina paused, eyebrows raised. "I'm Judge Carter," she replied, holding up her badge. "I'm presiding over the Brooks case this morning." The officer barely glanced at the badge. Instead, his cold, calculating eyes scanned her from head to toe. "There's been an incident nearby," he said. "You match the description of someone involved. I'll need you to answer a few questions." Nina felt a familiar burn of anger rising in her chest but maintained her composure. The irony was suffocating. She was about to preside over a trial about racial profiling, and here she was being profiled outside the courthouse. "Officer," she said evenly, "I don't have time for this. The trial begins in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." She held up her badge again, her patience thinning. The officer didn't budge. His hand hovered near his belt, close to the handcuffs clipped there. "I don't care who you say you are," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're coming with me." Nina's breath hitched. She had seen that look in his eyes before, a mixture of suspicion and contempt. It wasn't about her being a judge. It was about her being black. Before she could respond, another voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Nina turned to see a tall, older black officer approaching, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Carter?" he asked, his eyes widening. "Judge Carter?" "Yes," Nina replied tightly. The older officer's face darkened as he turned to the younger man. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice firm. The younger officer hesitated, his indignation apparent. "She matches the description," he mumbled. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" Grumbling under his breath, the younger officer stepped aside. Nina exhaled, her pulse still racing. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his tone softer now. "I'm fine," she said, though her clenched jaw betrayed her. Without another word, she strode into the courthouse, the sterile halls offering a small measure of comfort. But the encounter replayed in her mind on an endless loop. The courtroom fell silent as Nina banged her gavel. She called the session to order, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. The opening statements began, each word echoing in the chamber, but Nina's thoughts kept drifting back to the officer outside. His sneering face, the coldness in his tone, the way he had judged her in an instant. The parallels to Elijah Brooks' case were impossible to ignore. Elijah took the stand first. His testimony was raw, vivid, and heart-wrenching. He described every agonizing detail of the morning he was stopped, handcuffed, and humiliated while jogging through his own neighborhood. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Elijah said, his voice cracking. "I was just running, trying to clear my head." But in their eyes, that made me suspicious. Nina felt the weight of his words in her chest. She had heard stories like his countless times before, but today they hit differently. This wasn't just about Elijah. It was about the countless others like him. And in a way, it was about her. As Elijah continued, describing the shame and fear he had felt, Nina's gaze swept across the jury. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, their expressions unreadable. It was clear they were grappling with the gravity of the situation. The prosecution called their next witness. The courtroom doors creaked open, and Nina's heart sank as she recognized the young officer from earlier. His face was pale, his posture stiff as he made his way to the witness stand. Officer Ryan Blake, the prosecutor, Camille Turner, announced, her sharp gaze fixed on him. Camille was known for her tenacity, and today she was in her element. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Camille began. Officer Blake, she started, her tone measured but unyielding. Can you describe the events leading to Mr. Brooks' arrest? Ryan cleared his throat, avoiding Nina's gaze. I was patrolling the area, he began, when I saw Brooks jogging. He looked out of place. Nina's grip on her gavel tightened. That phrase, out of place, was a coded indictment she had heard far too many times. It meant he was black, and I didn't think he belonged. Camille pressed on, her voice slicing through the tension. What exactly made him look out of place? Ryan hesitated. He was acting nervous, looking around a lot. It seemed like he was up to something. Nina's anger simmered beneath her composed exterior. She had reviewed the case file thoroughly. Elijah hadn't been acting suspiciously. He had been standing on the corner, waiting for a rideshare. No crime, no probable cause. Camille's questioning intensified. Did you find any evidence linking Mr. Brooks to a crime? Ryan shifted again, his face reddening. No, he admitted quietly. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort and recognition. The truth was undeniable. Elijah Brooks had been arrested for nothing more than existing while black. When Camille delivered her closing argument, her voice was steady but impassioned. This case isn't just about Elijah Brooks, she declared, her gaze sweeping over the jury. It's about a pattern that has plagued our justice system for far too long. It's about officers like Ryan Blake, who see a black man in a neighborhood and immediately assume he doesn't belong. It's about how these assumptions lead to humiliation, fear, and injustice. And it's time for that to stop. Nina sat in her chambers as the jury deliberated late into the night, grappling with the weight of the case. She knew that the verdict, whatever it might be, was just one step in a much larger battle. The fight against systemic racism wouldn't end here, but every step mattered. The next morning, the jury returned to deliver their decision. Nina took her seat, her expression calm but her heart pounding. We find the defendant, Officer Ryan Blake, guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination, the foreperson announced. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Elijah Brooks' shoulders sagged with relief, tears glistening in his eyes as he embraced his family. Ryan Blake sat frozen, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, Nina saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a faint recognition of the harm he had caused. But it was too little, too late. As the courtroom emptied, Nina stayed behind, staring at the empty benches. The fight for justice wasn't over. It never would be. But today, they had taken a step forward, a small but significant step toward a fairer system. Change, Nina thought, didn't come all at once. It came piece by piece, one case, one verdict at a time. And today, they had laid another brick on the long road to justice.